You're muted, Aaron.
Take two. So, hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Aaron Risto, and I am the New York Egg Stewardship Program Manager with American Farmland Trust, and I direct the Genesee River Demonstration Farm Network, which highlights the impacts of practical and innovative conservation practices demonstrated on real working farms. This webinar is brought to you by a grant from the New York Farm Viability Institute and the New York Corn and Soybean Growers Association, and is part of a series of discussions focusing on farming in New York in a changing climate. There will be a final webinar in this series in March, so look for an announcement coming soon. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Genesee River Demonstration Farm Network page. The previous recorded webinars included an introduction to how our changing climate may impact agriculture in the Northeast, how the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act may impact agricultural production, and an introduction to biochar and its potential use on New York agricultural soils. These webinars are all currently available for viewing on the Demo Farm Network page, and I will be providing a link to that page in the chat here shortly. A couple of considerations. Please remember to mute your microphones throughout the presentations in order to preserve the continuity and to stay on time. We will reserve answering questions directly until the last 15 minutes or so, after all the presenters have gone. However, you are welcome to enter questions into the chat at any time. Due to the substantial participation today, we may not be able to answer every question posted, but the presenters have kindly offered to follow up with any relevant unanswered questions after the webinar if you are motivated to contact them directly after this event. And again, I will be posting these emails here shortly in the chat. By participating in the live webinar, a single certified crop advisor continuing education unit is being offered in the sustainability category. For those who need it, that's probably not relevant to most people on this call, but it is being offered. And I will post the tracking number and the QR code at the end of the presentations today. So today we have invited Ethan Winter, Northeast Solar Specialist with the American Farmland Trust, to kick off our discussion. Ethan helps set and implement AFT strategy for solar energy generation and farmland conservation. Ethan will be joined by David Kay and Dr. Katie Bills Walsh. David is a senior extension associate within the Department of Global Development at Cornell University and provides leadership for specific programming in the areas of energy, land use, community development, and regional economics. Dr. Katie Bills Walsh is a research associate with the Center for Conservation Social Sciences in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell University. Before joining Cornell, Katie completed a postdoc with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rangeland Resources and System Research Unit and the Northern Plains Climate Hub. It is a pleasure to welcome all three to share their knowledge and expertise around solar development in our region. Thank you all for joining us. Ethan, I hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I hope I'm coming across loud and clear. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again to the New York Farm Viability Institute for sponsoring this webinar series. We had over 200 folks register for today's webinar, a mix of county and municipal officials, farmers, researchers, and land trusts, and some solar developers. New York's clean energy transition is well underway, and we appreciate all the insights and questions that you all can bring to today's conversation. The overarching theme for our webinar is developing an understanding for strategies and research that we're going to need to balance and co-optimize renewable energy development and agriculture, where these uses are competing on the same land. I'm going to share a high-level perspective that informs AFT's approach to solar and why American Farmland Trust is getting pretty deep into this, both in New York and nationally. And I will provide a national context and some New York highlights in terms of the trend lines that we're seeing around solar. I'll be highlighting AFT's smart solar principles and why we're engaging in what's known as agrovoltaics, or agricultural dual use solar. And that will tee up Katie and David to speak to the updates on Cornell's growing research portfolio. The research at Cornell could have far-reaching implications for policy, land use planning, and how we develop incentives and mechanisms for balancing solar on farmland. So really delighted to have the Cornell team here today. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a background. Most of the folks here on the call are probably familiar with American Farmland Trust. We're the No Farms, No Food organization. We are emphasizing 3 interrelated strategies as we address climate change. First is protecting farmland and promoting intelligent, compact urban growth to reduce farmland loss. We know that farming, well-managed farmland, must be part of the climate solution, and that's why we must protect the most productive, versatile, and resilient farmland. A second key strategy is expanding adoption of regenerative practices such as cover cropping and no tillage to build soil carbon and improve soil health. We believe regenerative practices can also be integrated into solar development, and that's an area of research that we'll be talking to. Regenerative practices can boost farm productivity, improve water quality, and increase the resilience of our agricultural systems. So the third area that we're really focusing on, and is the centerpiece for today, is smart solar. This is advancing research and policies and collaborative strategies to ensure that farmers and rural communities will be full partners in this accelerating transition to renewable energy. At AFT, we've been fighting farmland loss for 40 years, and we've documented and analyzed the more historical drivers of farmland conversion, including poorly planned development, challenging economics for farmers, aging farmer demographics and barriers to the next generation of young and beginning farmers, and climate impacts that we're seeing accelerate almost on a monthly basis. Solar is interesting because it can really cut in a few different ways. It can support farm viability by providing a new form of income diversification, and it can also be highly disruptive if it unravels local farm networks. And that's something that we're really looking at in New York. AFT's program has developed a suite of initiatives to address farmland protection and to support farmers. So it makes a lot of sense for us to be thinking about solar, given the ambitious goals that the state is undertaking. American Farmland Trust, under its Farms Under Threat report, evaluated farmland loss between 2001 and 2016. As everyone on this call knows, New York is a leading agricultural state with over $5 billion in revenue, 30,000 farms, almost, 98% of them family owned. And what we found in the Farms Under Threat analysis was that in that period, we lost almost 250,000 acres of land to low density residential development and urban development. In that period, there was almost no real solar development to speak of on the New York landscape, and that is changing. So one thing we're really thinking about is how do those earlier analyses play into our future forecasts for land use in New York. Our Farms Under Threat 2040 report sought to look at this specifically. In that Farms Under Threat 2040 report, which was released last June, we included a smart solar case study, and we pulled off of the Department of Energy's Solar Futures study, and I'll be talking to that a little bit more in a couple of slides. But we found that a business as usual scenario for New York saw 450,000 acres of land converted, and a runaway sprawl scenario, almost 640,000 acres. So these are concerning trends, and they don't really include the prospect of large-scale solar development. So the key challenge for us is thinking about how solar will play into these other forces that are challenging farmland. And New York and the Northeast region are emerging as very important national test case for how solar will play out in rural communities. AFT believes that smart solar, done right, will improve social acceptance and community support for this renewable energy transition, which is so critical for tackling climate change. It won't happen without intention and creativity and solid research to support the policies. And that's what we're talking about today. Many of you have seen stories in the local media or may even be involved in projects going through your local planning review. We all know that farming is challenging and getting more difficult with extreme weather and thin margins, labor challenges, and increasing fuel costs. Perhaps your neighbor or you yourself are considering whether to sign a 30-year solar lease. And I want to just highlight that we are still in the early days of this transition. We really do want to get this right. And that's the spirit behind AFT's Smart Solar Principles. We've distilled 4 principles to guide AFT's work in this area. And not surprisingly, the first principle is protecting the most suitable land for agriculture and food production. We want to make sure that agriculture and energy development are not on a collision course, but can work together to support farm viability, particularly on our most productive lands. Secondly, we're looking to advocate for standards and best practices to ensure soil health, not only to grow food and fiber, but for all the ecosystem services that healthy soils provide. This is a key aspect of the work that Aaron is doing for us in New York. This means that farmland should also be returned to productive use after solar projects are decommissioned. A third area that we're focusing on and we'll highlight today is agrovoltaics. This is a fancy word for integrating agricultural use and energy generation on the same piece of land for the life of the project. And this can come in a number of different ways and forms. Really exciting area of innovation here. And finally, we're really wanting to make sure that all of this work runs through an equity and farm viability lens. That at the end of the day, we're taking care of the farmers who take care of us. One thing I'll add is that this approach is taking hold not only in New York, but around the world. We're looking at examples in Europe and Japan, where agrovoltaics is being scaled up to support agriculture and energy as a shared purpose. To understand where we're heading, it's helpful to see some of the information from the energy sector itself. Solar now represents the majority of new installed energy capacity in the United States. And this graph shows the increase in particular in utility scale solar. Just want you to sort of absorb this for a minute. The lower area shows residential solar. That's typically on your rooftop. Commercial solar, which might be on warehouses or in the fields. Community solar, which has been a key aspect of New York's energy policy. And the blue on the top is larger scale utility. This is where a large amount of the growth is going to occur in New York. These projects will be permitted through the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, also known as ORES, under the 94C regulations. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and state mandates, we're going to see a real acceleration of larger scale solar. New York is already a top 10 solar state. We recently passed Massachusetts, and we will continue to sort of climb up the rankings here over time. Just for perspective, California and Texas have a significantly more installed capacity than New York. States like New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts are highly land constrained, and to the extent that we've got communities bordering solar, that will be an area of tension going forward and something that we're looking at. In our Farms Under Threat report, which I mentioned earlier, we looked at threats to agricultural land by state. And one thing we have noted is that 8 of the top 10 solar states also rank as high threat in our Farms Under Threat analysis. What this means is that states that are already facing significant farmland conversion threat are also now looking at a significant solar pressure. What this means for farm viability and land use planning is really important. So I'm just highlighting here that states like New York are not alone, and we're looking at how we're balancing scaling up of solar in a way that it doesn't add or accelerate farmland loss. How much land are we going to need for solar to decarbonize the grid and to electrify our transportation, our heating and cooling, and our manufacturing processes? This is a really important question when we think about this on a national basis. Last year, the Department of Energy released the Solar Futures Study. This report looked to 2040 to 2050 and estimated that we would need 8 to 10 million acres of utility scale ground mounted solar across the country, primarily in rural communities, over the next 20 to 25 years. This certainly got our attention, and this analysis has been something we've been looking at to better understand how different states are expected to absorb solar development in the years to come. And just to give you a sense of scale here, state of Maryland is about 8 million acres. So we're talking about pretty significant expansion of solar. Oops. On a state-by-state basis, some states like Texas and Florida could see over 1 million acres of solar over the next 20 or so years. And again, how this is done is really going to matter. What kind of solar, where that's located, and what kind of agricultural co-utilization is integrated into the solar market. This map shows 8 of those top 10 solar states across the country in the yellow dots there, and New York being one of those top 10 states. So again, these are states that are already facing significant farmland conversion threats. We want to see solar help and not hurt our agricultural economy. New York has been a leader in community solar. This is an area that I worked in prior to my work with AFT. And what is going to happen over the next few years is that the light blue bar on the top of this graph is going to grow significantly. That is the large scale solar that will be driven due to mandates from the climate law in New York, CLCPA. And so we're going to see significant growth in the utility sector. Something I just wanted to highlight here, because the kind of solar that's coming matters. The New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which I just mentioned, mandates a 70% renewable energy portfolio by 2030 and a zero emission grid by 2040. What we're likely to see are more larger projects in agricultural areas over the next 20 years to meet those mandates. This map is interesting because it shows how community solar and large-scale solar are distributed across the region. States like Massachusetts have been primarily community solar. Those are your existing yellow circles. States like Pennsylvania don't have any community solar program to speak of at all. New York has both, large transmission scale projects as well as community solar. How much solar are we going to need to meet the state's climate goals? If you dig really deeply into the Climate Action Council's scoping plan, there are a couple of different models there. And the answer is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 megawatts or 60 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2050. That's a very significant increase over where we are now, which is about 4 gigawatts across the state. So we are looking at a 15-fold increase in the amount of solar that we're going to need to install by 2050 to meet the solar targets and the climate goals for New York State. To summarize what that means, conservatively, you're looking at somewhere between 300 and 400,000 acres of solar, assuming that most of the solar, let's say 80% of that, is ground-mounted PV, and a reasonable estimate of 7.5 acres per megawatt for your facility area. Cornell did a recent study that came out that showed that over 80% of the land that's most suitable for utility solar is agricultural land. That's why many of you are seeing projects being proposed in agricultural areas. Sharing the same resource, that's largely a function of the transmission infrastructure and shared suitability characteristics. Good farmland is often a good place for solar. We found this also in our New York Farmland report released by AFT last year. We found that solar is not evenly distributed across the New York landscape. And this information is already somewhat dated, but we analyzed the New York Independent System Operator interconnection queue, and we found that there were real constellations of projects based on that transmission capacity. Some of that overlapped with the most productive land in the state of New York, including Montgomery County, St. Lawrence County, and Genesee County. We have folks from all of those counties on today's call. In that report, we also asked farmers what they would like to see to offset the impacts of solar on farmland. We found fairly strong interest in opportunities to protect the land after the project was decommissioned. We found interest in continuing agricultural activities with the project, whether it was grazing or growing crops. And this is an area for New York to really be exploring further. What might this look like? The Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab has done some important research and is funding more research in this area. AFT is partnering with the Rutgers Agrovoltaics program on an exciting new partnership looking at this in New Jersey. And we hope to see more of this in New York. This co-utilization can work with both more conventional utility scale configurations where you're creating space between the panels for grazing, specialty crops, or pollinators. There are also alternative configurations where you're raising the panels, spreading them out, or even using vertical bifacials. And these are known as solar fences. This is all pretty new technology for the US, but it's something that we're really interested in seeing scale up if it can be viable. This shows what this might look like. These are images of projects that are in operation now. The Solar Grazing Association that was mentioned earlier is quite active in providing support for grazers who are providing a service to these projects. We're also seeing poultry paired with solar. Specialty crops can be grown underneath panels, and there's increasing interest in cattle grazing using elevated panels, such as the project in Massachusetts in the lower right corner. So that project was one of the first in the country to be elevated for cattle and is the first in Massachusetts to qualify for the dual use solar incentive. To wrap up, AFT is paying close attention to what the agencies are doing in this area, and we're monitoring some interesting innovation and activities here. First, the Department of Agriculture and Markets has established guidelines for soil protection on solar projects. These are some of the first solar-specific construction guidelines in the country, and we share these with other states. The state also has an agricultural mitigation program for projects that impact more than 30 acres of agricultural land with mineral soil groups 1 to 4. Ag and Markets has also been convening a farmland protection working group, which has issued an interim report and is moving to a final report with recommendations for research in the area of dual use and smart solar. We're working with NYSERDA. That agency is developing a smart solar scorecard. It is now in its third year of use, and it will be used to evaluate large-scale projects in the competitive solicitation process. NYSERDA is also going to be instituting a incentive for co-utilization that will allow for the deferral of mitigation payments if those projects meet certain standards for co-utilization. On the radar for NYSERDA is a potential incubator program for agrovoltaics that we would certainly encourage. NYSERDA is convening an agricultural technical working group, which will be continuing to refine, improve that smart solar scorecard over the years to come, and has become a real, I think, a pretty active convening for stakeholders such as Cornell and AFT to support best practices in research. One of the areas of research that is on the radar for NYSERDA and the Ag Tech Working Group is a cumulative impact assessment to really understand what happens as solar gets stacked into certain parts of the state. We're also tracking legislation, and I just wanted to flag a bill that was signed by the governor in November, which will steer funds from the agricultural mitigation program into local farmland protection. So in wrapping up, I just wanted to make sure that I'm sharing some resources on AFT's Smart Solar program. We recently released a guide for agricultural landowners interested in solar leasing. This is a great resource for farmers to go through before they make any commitments. We also are providing information on the National Agri-Solar Clearinghouse. And I have a couple of other links here as well that we'll share with all of you. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and give it over to Cornell.
All right, thank you, Ethan. Go ahead, David.
Okay, let me just see whether I can now share my screen. Take a minute. One thing while I'm doing that, I just wanted to make a slight emphasis on something that Ethan was talking about, which is, most of the land that will be affected by large scale solar development that's being planned is, as he said, is very large scale. There is still quite a bit of there are many projects, let's put it that way, that are in the large scale category, which means, let's say 100 acres or a little more than that, that still will be going not through state review, but through local government review. So there will be a lot, unless you consider 100 and 150 acres small. It's called utility scale, but it does still go through local review. So I just wanted to make sure that local government people and local people are aware that they will be seeing a lot of projects that are big, but are in fact still going through local review. And I'm kind of delaying here because I'm having trouble finding my the screen I want to share. So
Okay, yeah, we'll give you a second to look.
Maybe you could answer a couple questions actually while I look for this, because it's a little weird. It usually pops right up.
One question that I think would be quick to answer was the source on the data for the map that you showed at first, Ethan. I think it was one of your first slides. Do you know the source?
Unfortunately, I shared a few different maps, but
yeah, I think it was from a very early slide.
we had if it was the map showing the conversion, that's from our Farms Under Threat report.
Okay.
And we'll share that in our links.
Okay. David, I think you're ready now. Is that it?
I'm going to see whether when I try and share the screen, I see the right screen. There it is. Okay. All right. Can you see this now? If you can, I'll move into
yes, and then
presentation mode.
Yep, and then I think we'll be good to go.
Okay. You can see the presentation mode now?
Yes.
All right. So just main thing on here is my contact information. If you want to follow up with anything, is down there on the left, dlk2@cornell.edu. So my task after the excellent overview of what's going on nationally, really, and in New York State, is I just want to highlight a little bit of the work that is underway and about to commence at Cornell specifically. And then my colleague Katie will take a little deeper dive into one of the projects that we're working on jointly and mention a few other things. So one of the things I want to mention, and there's way too much to cover, of course, in such a short time period. So this is just kind of like a high level overview for you all to, if something catches your attention, to maybe pay attention to as it evolves, or follow up with Katie or myself about. So one thing I wanted to mention is that our Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability leadership there has recently acknowledged the extent of work on solar, which is some of it's been going for a while, but much of it is just underway or still in the planning processes. But what they've done is they've put together a website to try and make it easier to access work that is going on, and even more the faculty and staff names of people that are working on various things. So I have here kind of the landing page for this website. It's only been up a few years. A few weeks. It's still under development, and but it is kind of our main online point of entry for finding out what kind of work is going on here. And as you scroll down that page, what you'll see is some things that have been highlighted about work that's already underway. So you can see there, this is just from the web page. You can see that there is work on agrovoltaics and ecosystem services, wildlife and ecosystem impacts, solar panel reuse and recycling. Some of this is basic science, not really focused in on land use issues or economic issues, which are the kind of things that, and community acceptance issues, which are the kind of things that Katie and I as social scientists pay attention to. But some of it is in that category. So you can see here with the highlights in yellow, some of the kinds of things that are already highlighted on this website. And by the way, just to go back for a second, if you want to find the website, the best way to get to it is to Google sustainable solar at Cornell. Rather than trying to copy the URL, but we could share the URL if you can't find it. And we also, this site will be being developed over the next year or two, so it contains a lot more information than it currently does. The main thing that's really on the website at the moment, which I want to highlight, is the people that have at the university or affiliated with the university who have essentially said, hey, I'm doing enough work on this topic that I want to have my picture and contact information and name highlighted on here. So what you can see here is that 33 people across the system have identified themselves so far. They come from over 20 units or departments and our cooperative extension system. There could be a lot more people whose faces could be on here, and I'm sure there will be more in the future, because they're particularly in the extension system. There's a group, which I'll mention in a minute, which is not well represented on this link. But if you go to the page and you look at what these people are involved in, and you consider you follow the link to their home pages, you'll see generally what they work on. And most of the time there's something, not with everybody, most of the time they're doing enough work on solar related topics that you can see what they're working on and follow up. I will mention, as I said before, that I represent kind of the social science aspect of this work, as does Katie. And so far, of the more than 30 people on this list, there are only 5 of us that are social science faculty. So we're trying to build our capacity, particularly in that arena. So now I'm trying to move. Okay. I think it would. Okay. So I just wanted to mention, I assume almost everybody, if not everybody, is familiar with Cornell Cooperative Extension. my affiliation is with Extension. Our system, but I just want to mention that Extension actually really brought to us, as they did with the high volume hydraulic fracking from county offices, the sort of initial awareness from counties that there was leasing going on out there in communities, and that this is something we ought to pay attention to. So we essentially, the point here is we essentially have educators in every state in the county, and many of those folks are now well networked. Some of them are on this call, trying to connect people and communities with the best available information about this evolving issue, which is really very new. Large scale, there's been solar in New York, as Ethan mentioned, for a while. This large scale solar and competition for farmland, potential competition, this is really very new. So there isn't like a long history of experience to draw on about what's happening here. You know, this is just emphasizing that our team, our Ag Solar Working Group of Extension folks, is really trying to build our capacity to respond to community need on this topic. We've done a number of things over the past few years, but our current initiative, which I want to make sure you're aware of, and maybe I can ask Aaron if he's able to put some links in the chat. If not, you can follow up with me afterwards. So we've been collaborating with Penn State, which has a very similar set of issues to deal with, on a webinar series. I hope some of you have participated in past webinars. Some of those are on the right, listed on the right, but there's many more that are listed there, focused on solar related issues, particularly around solar leasing. We've started a new series at noon, one of which has already happened, and there's a link to that under about preserving ag in the face of growing solar development, and then focusing several additional series on agrovoltaics and a Q&A if you want to register for those. Again, I'm hoping that Aaron can put those links in the chat. So how about more on the research side? So here's one bit of research that's been pretty far down the road on one of our Cornell sites. There was work looking at, in collaboration with the American Solar Grazing Association, there was work looking at stocking densities for sheep. You can access that through the clearinghouse, which is an excellent source of information nationally. Got their logo there. You can see that they concluded essentially out of this work so far that stocking densities, firstly, that it was successful, you could use sheep to graze successfully, and that stocking densities can be optimized depending on your management goals. Waiting for my next slide to come forward. This is for some reason quite slow. Okay. I wanted to mention another project, which is not as far as along, that's led by Professor Todd Schmidt in the College of Business, he's director of the Cornell University Cooperative Enterprise Program. So he has a significant scaled project trying to work with farmers, solar companies, and again with ASGA to explore the economic benefits specifically of some kind of farm cooperative organization that could help coordinate land management services with sheep for farmers. So there's more information about that available through Todd, but Katie and I could be access. If you want to find out more about it, we can help you access that information. I'll turn now to a project that I'm involved in, which is really focused on the leasing questions. It's in collaboration with Shannon Farrell at Oklahoma State and Paul Gehringer at the University of Maryland, and my colleague at Cornell, Allison Chatrashan. So you can see a little bit about the methods, but basically we have two goals for this work. which should be completed in the next year or year and a half, which is on the legal side in our 3 states to do somewhat of a comparative analysis of the policy environment, and then focus on the issues that landowners and farmers should be addressing in their lease negotiations. There is a draft guidebook for users that will be coming out of this work that's being pursued by Shannon and Paul, who are attorneys. And then my side of it and Allison's side is more social science. And what we're trying to do is learn what we can from about the area-wide economic, social, and environmental impacts that are in lease provisions, given that some of what's signed in those leases covers some of the same territory that is addressed by public policy and permits, and some of it is not addressed by public policy. So in aggregate, these leases have some, if you will, private contract control in aggregate over what's happening in communities. And again, we'll be putting a variety of educational materials and webinars out as we complete that. Couple new major research projects that were just funded by the Department of Energy include this one, which I'm part of, which is really a very ambitious effort to try and put together a holistic framework to assess costs and benefits of ecosystem services at solar facilities. This is not focused exclusively on agriculture. It's taking a look at a variety of different kinds of impacts on the environment and on the social and economic landscapes of these sites, but it does include agriculture and agrovoltaics as part of what we'll be looking at. There's another project and Max Zhang is the director of that. And Steve Grodsky on the other side has got another large project, which is a little bit more, from my perspective as a social scientist, technically oriented about using some basic science to characterize pollinator diversity at solar facilities. Just a couple more here. I also want to mention our campus sustainability office, which is not a research entity, but collaborates with us as researchers and actually has been helping the university decarbonize its own energy supply, but in a research context also provides us on occasion with solar sites that Cornell owns and controls that it gives us access to for research as appropriate. Finally, I just wanted to mention that some of us are advising a national scale social science project on community-centered solar development run through the DOE. And you can see here what the key research questions about this project, research project are. That's really just getting, it's sort of into its first year, but it's just about to send some data collection mechanisms into the field. Trying to look at support and opposition for solar, economic impacts, equity impacts, and impacts on land use. And some of it's actually looking at 7 sites around the country. None of them are in New York. So we're trying to make our work in New York be as complementary as possible to their work. And that's my section. I'm going to hand it over to Katie now to kind of pick up the ball there.
Excellent. Let me share my screen. If you could stop sharing, David, that would be great. Okay. Excellent. Well, I'm really happy to be here. And in the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through some of this. I'm more than happy to answer any questions during the Q&A, or please feel free to reach out to me directly. I know my email has been placed in the chat, and it'll also be on this final slide. So David mentioned when talking about the Sustainable Solar Initiative at Cornell that we're trying to beef up our social science capacity. So I wanted to just highlight, what that means and what opportunities that affords, because social science research on solar development is critically important. We're better able to understand and gather insights about people's beliefs, their perceptions, and how they make decisions related to, in this case, support for or opposition to large-scale solar projects. We think about topics like community acceptance, what community impacts will occur, trade-offs, and the implications of the way people are making decisions about solar in their communities. And that's because social science allows us to study really complex questions, because the landscape here is complicated. There's competing land use demands, people with different preferences and priorities. So the complex questions are important so we can learn about trade-offs, how people are weighing pros and cons and how they eventually arrive at a decision, the impacts, social and community impacts, but also economic impacts and how these are intertwined. Importantly, not only are we interested in people's beliefs and perceptions, but how those may change over time and of what particular nudges need to happen for people to alter their beliefs or perceptions, under what conditions can and do those change. And lastly, these are some examples, but one being, what are the networks people rely on for information and support? Where is that information coming from? How is it being messaged? And who are folks turning to chat about these issues and gain information? So that's just a broad overview of some of the social science context in relation to solar work. But now I'll dive into one project that we are doing right now. So I don't have any results to share yet, but hopefully the next webinar we participate in will have some findings. And this is a project in which David is the principal investigator, and it's called Landowners, Farmers, and the Community Impacts of Large-Scale Solar Development. And there's a few broad objectives that are guiding this work. So one is we want to better understand landowners' expectations, but also their experiences with their land use preferences and the perceived and actual costs and benefits of solar development in their communities. And part of that project will also be a series of economic impact analyses at the state and county level to understand the potential impacts of solar development on the economy. And lastly, we will evaluate the perceived or likely implication of solar development for farmers, including farmers who rent, who maybe don't own the land that they do most of their farming on, and also the households who depend on farm businesses for their livelihoods. So how will we be doing this? We will be conducting this work in 3 counties across New York State. And where we're at right now in the research is selecting those counties. We're having active discussions and gathering information to make the best choice we can about where to conduct this work. But there will be some geographic diversity with a county selected in Western New York, in the North Country, and in the Hudson River Valley. And each of these counties will feature a large number of projects that are either proposed or in construction at various phases in the process. And although we're kind of operationalizing this at the county level, we will be conducting the work in the towns that are set to host these projects. And we'll use mixed methods to meet our objectives. We will conduct formal interviews and focus groups with landowners, with folks in local government who are overseeing some of the permitting and things taking place locally, with industry representatives and developers. And we will also survey landowners near these planned solar project sites. And what's unique about this project is it's highly collaborative across departments at Cornell, but also we have a project advisory board, a broad group of stakeholders representing various sectors and interests who provide feedback and weigh in on the project as it moves forward. And we just had our first project advisory board meeting at the end of November. So it's great to get all of those people in the room to share perspectives and learn how people are considering questions about solar development on farmland in New York State. And we're excited to continue this work and share results eventually down the line. My last slide here is sharing 2 projects that right now aren't yet underway, but have been submitted for funding. So we're seeking funding to do this work. And one is specifically, geared towards agrovoltaics. So to assess landowner willingness to host agrovoltaics in New York State. And this project emerged because we heard anecdotally a lot that projects that have an agrivoltaic component increase community acceptance. But we didn't see a lot of evidence-based research or reports to corroborate that. So we thought it best to plan a project that could collect data on landowner beliefs, attitudes, and interests in agrivoltaic systems. And part of this work will also be identifying policy-based barriers and opportunities to implementing agrivoltaics in New York State by reviewing farmland protection plans, by interviewing members of farmland protection boards at the local and municipal levels, to understand those barriers and opportunities that exist in relation to AV. And the last project is being led by Wendong Zhang. He's an assistant professor and extension economist in the Dyson School here at Cornell. And he is trying to better understand the extent of foreign land ownership across the state and the implications of foreign land ownership on solar development. So it'll be interesting to see if hopefully these projects get funded. They'll start in the fall, and we'll be able to share more at that time. So I'll conclude just by saying thank you so much for being here. We're excited about all the work that's taking place at Cornell, and especially since there's a lot underway now. So in the next couple of years, the insights will be more concrete, and we'll have a lot more to share in lieu of results. So a couple links to Cornell Cooperative Extension and that sustainable solar site. So excited for a lively Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Katie and David and Ethan. So we are going to move to some of the questions now. We are a little low on time, and there are some really good questions and also just some points that are made here in the chat. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Stephanie Castle, who is also at American Farmland Trust, and she's going to go ahead and present some of the questions to the panelists.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, there was a lot of really good questions, and I don't think that we're going to get to all of them, but there's a few that I can sort of clump together here, and it has to do with the what's going on at the state level in terms of funding that is supposed to be paid into the Farmland Preservation Fund by solar developers. They want to know if the funds are actually going to be used for that purpose. And also, is there any regulation incorporated into the ORA's structure that limits the amount of high quality farmland converted into solar? I would say any one of our presenters can take the lead on those questions.
Ethan, I can start.
I would just speak to the Agricultural and Farmland Viability Fund is the concept that AFT recommended, because we did have concern that mitigation dollars weren't necessarily going to be reinvested in local agriculture. That legislation was just passed, and we'll try to get some more information on how much revenue they actually expect from that. Mitigating the funds that could come into that are this deferral concept from NYSERDA, where projects that are implementing co-utilization for the first 5 years of the project would be able to defer that mitigation payment. AFT is concerned that that's not enough time, and that that co-utilization should really last for 20 years of the NYSERDA contract. That's something that we've been relaying to the agency. So we'll keep an eye on that.
So I would just add, these, firstly, these policies, all of these kinds of policies are kind of being made, as you can kind of hear, as we speak to some extent, and they're evolving. So, just want to emphasize again, the extent to which this is relatively new in the policy arena, and for better or worse, it will be useful to stay in touch with people like the American Farmland Trust, who are spending a lot of time monitoring what's going on. So the second thing I would say, because I saw it in the chat, is I'm not aware if there's been a clear commitment yet on exactly how that funding, which is being collected, is going to be used and what's the best way to use that funding. It will be used for farmland preservation, but what does that exactly mean? To my knowledge, there's still dialogue about that, and there are a couple committees, including the one that Ethan and I and quite a few other people are involved in, which are having input to that process, but we're not sure where that's going to come out. And then I forgot, Stephanie, there was one other part, the last part of the question that's slipping my mind at the moment about what kinds of disincentives are being put in place, I think, for building
ORAs.
on good farmland. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
That the state is currently doing. So again, I think Ethan alluded to the fact that there is already a process in place within NYSERDA, which is different. So this is about which developers are selected to get essentially renewable energy credits at the front end, which are very important for a developer to be able to develop. So there is a screening process already going on that prioritizes in various ways farmland, avoiding farmland and mitigating any impacts on farmland. So but again, that's still evolving over time. We're trying to learn about how that works, and the state is trying to learn about how that works. That's different from the permitting process, but which is the ORAS process, or the local government process, as they do the permits, because it's at the front end rather than of the development process, rather than when the permit is actually issued. But the state is making significant efforts, as they need to coordinate what NYSERDA is doing at the front end with what happens at the permitting and implementation and enforcement stages. I don't know, is that good enough? Ethan, would you?
Yeah, that frames it well, and it's imperfect. It's also, I think, maybe the first example anywhere in the country where there is actually an agricultural mitigation payment requirement and a scorecard for large scale solar. So other states are looking to New York, and that's why we want to make sure we're setting a high bar here. States like Virginia that have very ambitious solar goals are taking a close look at what NYSERDA is setting up. So we'll continue to stay engaged. The Agricultural Technical Working Group does publish its meetings, and we'll put that link on the website or on the chat.
So the next question has to do with agrivoltaics, and wondering what the proportion of solar projects being installed have agrivoltaics involved with them, and what can we do to increase the participation of agrivoltaics in new solar projects?
I'll take a stab at this first. I think some of our proposed work is trying to get at that. Are landowners willing to engage in agrivoltaic systems? What would they need to look like? Under what conditions? To better understand how much agrivoltaics can be done at scale, because that's a big question now as these projects are getting larger. And I think something else I wanted to mention in relation to the last question is just that I know at the more local level, some IDAs are implementing rules and regulations that require developers to pay more for prime agricultural land, to disincentivize them from developing on prime farmland. So that's just an aside. It's something going on kind of at a different level. And I did see a question related to this about is agrivoltaics a red herring? Do people want sheep? And I think that's what this proposed work is getting at. I remember being at the Ag Extension in service a couple months ago, and an extension agent said, people don't do sheep in my county. So talking about how everyone can graze sheep doesn't apply. We don't know how much people are actually interested in doing that and adapting to that. So I think all of that is really valid, and we're learning more and more about some of those dimensions so that we can better understand what can be carried out and what makes sense for the people involved who are most affected.
Can I just also point out that this is New York, right? You're not going to get everybody to agree on what the best land use is, and whether sheep should be incentivized the same way as bees, as should be incentivized the same way as dairy, continuing dairying or vegetables or field crops or whatever. So part of what's going on right now is like trying to understand the preferences and belief systems of different groups who have a stake in what's going to happen on these landscapes. Our work is focused primarily on landowners and farmers, but they're not, as we all know, like landowners and farmers don't necessarily run the world. So other people's opinions count too. And we have to, the state has to integrate all of them. So.
And one thing I'll add is the concept of specialty crops in and around systems is pretty nascent. As David said, this is all pretty new. The Department of Energy announced some grants last month. And again, this relates to the AFT Rutgers partnership, where they'll be developing field trials for specialty crops on sites built by Rutgers, and we'll be developing a farmer training program to help educate and engage farmers in New Jersey who are interested in integrating specialty crops around solar. And again, this is about how to create opportunities for farmers who are interested in solar and want to keep farming and understand the land constraints in a place like New Jersey, where it's going to be really hard to do a lot of solar without displacing the high value crops that they have around their market. So stay tuned on that. I'll put a link into the chat on the DOE funding so folks can see that.
Stephanie, if I could just jump in with one other thing, because I actually have to leave in just a minute to go facilitate another session. And this is like, I noticed a number of questions about end of life kinds of, which is a topic of great interest to many people, both in terms of the viability of farming, after the facility is done being a solar facility, if it ever stops being a solar facility, which is unclear, and also on who pays for decommissioning, all these kinds of things. So there is some policy in place, which is essentially in most places, trying to financially guarantee as much as possible, from what we know today, that the companies essentially have put the money in place to pay for decommissioning through various mechanisms. But the sad fact is, or the reality is, we have next to no actual real world experience with decommissioning large facilities. We don't know what recycling markets are going to look like 30 years from now. So there's just a lot of inherent uncertainty about trying to predict what is going to happen to in decommissioning right now. There are obviously plenty of people taking a look at this, but you're not going to find, I hope you aren't satisfied with the answers you get right now. If anybody tells you something, it's got to be contingent, because we have next to no experience doing it. So that's my take on it. And I apologize because I have to leave.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, David and Katie and Ethan. We are going to wrap it up because we are over time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so thank you so much to the participants that joined us today. I hope you learned something. At the very least, you have some resources here to consider when you have some questions. And so there's a lot of information available and a lot of things in development. So things will be changing, but wanted to have this overview out there. And as I said, this will be recorded. I'll see about what I can do about getting the chat and the questions downloaded and shared. But the video will be up very soon, and we will follow up with a follow-up email. So thanks everyone for participating, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.